Thank you very much. Just 2 days to go. If you are British, you'll feel like a prison sentence is about to end and we will escape. But of course, we won't necessarily escape depending on the outcome, because there'll be a lot of post-match debate. But it is seen as the biggest single risk for financial markets by investors polled by BAML earlier this month. So it affects not just Britain, but the whole world. And at the moment, the outcome is too close to call. I did a slide late last week when the polls marginally favoured Leave. They marginally favour Remain at the moment, and the betting markets moved significantly to favour Remain over the last couple of days. But if you average the last 6 or so polls, there's only about 1% in it, well within the margin of error. And the margin of error, as we saw in the general election of 2015, was significantly higher. So I think it's very much depends on what happens on the day, and the outlook for the weather forecast on Thursday is for torrential rain, which might depress turnout in London, where the Remain side is likely to be stronger. So it's very much a guess. And the reason the gamblers are so confident is that other referenda have shown a status quo bias at the end: Quebec independence, Scottish independence, and that's what they seem to be counting on. And we can only see that the polls came before David Beckham's dramatic intervention in the debate today, where he's gone for Remain. You laugh, but I sat through a description of a focus group where people were asked who would they trust most on their views of Brexit, and the answers were David Beckham and the Queen. The Queen's keeping stum, so it's David or nobody. So how have the markets reacted? So here again, this is up until late last week, before yesterday, and you can see sterling so far this year has tended to fall. You've seen quite dramatic shifts of a cent or two when polls have come out for one side or the other, but a Leave vote tends to cause a fall, and a Remain vote tends to cause a rise. There was about a 3% shift just yesterday. When it comes to bond markets, we've seen bond markets fall right round the world. Some people interpret a lower bond yield as interpreting that it's fine, nobody's worried about a Leave vote, but I think, in fact, it's pointing to safe haven flows into bonds, and you can see that clearly in Germany, where we did get negative. So again, yesterday, when Remain appeared to be doing a bit better in the polls, we saw bond yields rise, not fall. And then finally, on equities, the UK market has lagged the S&P 500 so far this year. And there was again a rally yesterday. You would expect the FTSE 100 in a Leave scenario to do rather better than the FTSE 250. The FTSE 100 is much more multinational, has miners, it has oil companies in it, which will be less affected by Brexit than the more domestically oriented FTSE 250. But if everything rose 3% or so yesterday on a poll looking for Remain, then you would expect at least that kind of fall, if probably not more, on a Leave vote. Because if you look at what's priced in, and you look at that BAML poll again as to what investors think, investors seem to be lining up behind the gambling market. So the people who think it's not very likely, to the left-hand side of that bar chart, around 2/3 of fund managers think it's not likely that the UK will vote for Brexit. Therefore, if it does happen, there would be quite a significant shift in the markets. So what are the arguments on both sides? Well, the arguments for Leave, the crucial one perhaps is to do with sovereignty, that people feel the EU is not democratic, that the European courts can override British court decisions, that Britain is only one voice out of 28 nations and sometimes gets outvoted. Regulations, the argument that there are many bureaucratic rules, often these are put in trivial terms about the shape of bananas and the ability to recycle tea leaves, but some people feel very strongly about it. There's the budget contribution. The Leave campaign tends to talk about 19 billion, but the net figure is 8 billion once you allow for a rebate and the money that flows back. Probably the key argument in terms of the general public and what is likely to move most votes is immigration. And of course, the single market, there's no restriction on freedom of movement of European workers into the UK. That causes some resentment. And then longer term, there is the argument that shackling the Britain to the European economy will be less good than seeking the opportunities to trade with China, India, and other emerging markets. And on the Remain side, the argument is that single market is extremely important. It's still 44% of UK exports. The importance of financial services. We've had 3 banks indicate in the last couple of weeks that jobs may have to move if Leave wins. There are 2 areas where that's significant. One is in the clearing of euro transactions. That was something the ECB wanted to see move to Frankfurt, but it was blocked by a European Court of Justice decision under appeal of the UK government. Obviously, if Britain leaves the Europe, then the European Court of Justice ruling won't help because it won't be governing it. So that there is an expectation those transactions would move. And secondly, there's the issue of passporting. You need to have a headquarters within an EU country to get your financial services sold throughout the 28 nations. So companies would have to move some operations to within the EU to take advantage of the passporting rules. The third argument is the shock to confidence, which may damage GDP in the short term. I chaired a debate among economists last night. I don't think there's really any serious doubt that that's going to be a problem because of the lack of clarity about what the future would be like outside the EU. And then the argument that by cutting off these trade links, by taking quite a long time to repair them, there are something like 30-odd EU agreements with other nations that Britain would have to replicate, that would damage trade in the long term. There is basically no ally or international body that seems to think it's a good idea for Britain to leave the EU. The kind of nations that we trade with, it's argued that we trade with outside the EU, like India, they're keen for us to stay within the EU. So let's look at some of those issues. Is regulation really a problem? So there are 2 axes on this graph. One is of product regulation, the other is of labour market regulation. And you can see that Britain is right at the least regulated end of the EU. Already we have opt-outs from various regulations. The labour market in Britain is perceived to be extremely flexible. That's why employment is at a record high in Britain. It's pretty hard to see, and I had 2 labour economists on this panel last night, pretty hard to see what would change if Britain left the EU on the labour market side. And surveys don't suggest that Britain is particularly over-regulated. So the World Bank Ease of Doing Business survey had Britain 6th. That's just 1 place behind Hong Kong, 1 place above the US. The Index of Economic Freedom had us 10th, ahead of the US. The World Economic Forum, perhaps a lot of you go to Davos, survey of global competitiveness ranks Britain 10th, and that's ahead of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So it's hard from the outside to see where it is that Britain is tied down by these regulations. And in one area, in this particular form, it might be bad if there were environmental bonfire. Before Britain joined the EU, we were often known as the dirty man of Europe. As a kid, I remember having to be very careful when you got in the sea by what might be floating around your feet, and the emission of sewage directly into the sea was only stopped as a result of EU regulations. Sulfur dioxide emissions came through too. EU has put in carbon targets, which obviously back up the British government's carbon targets, but also kind of reinforces the need for them to try and meet them. And that drive might clearly slip under a post-Brexit government. Many of the Brexit campaigners are also climate change skeptics. Lord Lawson, famously, John Redwood, Owen Paterson, Douglas Carswell, and environmental regulations are some of the ones they are most keen to cite as being the ones that the EU is most onerous in putting forward. So we would have quite a different change of tone in government under a plausible post-Brexit scenario. Then there's foreign direct investment. A survey found that Britain was 3rd in the world for foreign direct investment last year. About half of that comes from within the EU. And the fact, of course, that Britain is in the EU must influence outside companies to decide whether or not to invest in Britain as a base for the EU. And Ernst & Young's survey found just under 3/4 of investors cite access to the single market as a key attraction. We cited just last week in The Economist this quote from Shinzo Abe: "A vote to leave would make the UK a less attractive destination for Japanese investment." So that is, of course, one of the potential risks to the UK economy post a leave vote on Thursday, that foreign direct investment would slow or even possibly reverse. Immigration, again, the economic arguments are much easier to put than the cultural arguments, which are the ones that are probably successful with the electorate. So the economic argument against immigration tends to be based on the lump of labour fallacy, that there is only a set amount of work, and when immigrants come, they take the jobs of UK people. But of course, immigrants spend money. When they spend money, that creates jobs for other UK workers. The same argument about the lump of labour was put forward in the 50s and 60s by men who didn't want to see women come into the jobs market because they'd cause mass male unemployment. Thankfully, we have many women here. My wife works, and somehow the men are scraping by and managing to work in jobs. So the lump of labour argument is often hidden behind many of these kind of arguments about immigration. And indeed, there's a public service argument, but anybody who lives here again will know if you go to visit the NHS, it's quite likely you'll be treated from someone from abroad. 26% of all doctors are outside British, born outside Britain. But clearly there have been, in some areas, pressure on public services from immigration, where a lot of people have come someplace. So the pressure on primary school places, pressure on waiting lists, and arguably it's been the UK government's problem that they haven't devoted enough resources to dealing with this issue. There was a fund, a migrant impact fund, that was abolished under the 2010 to 2015 government, and that probably turned out to be a mistake. There's also a sense that for people like me, in the middle classes, free movement seems a very good deal. It seems less attractive to working class voters out in rural areas where they're probably not able to take advantage of the ability to work in Germany or Spain. So if you look at the polls, there's a clear majority among middle class voters to vote for Remain, and a clear majority among working class voters to vote for Leave. Again, this is one of the turnout issues. Working class voters tend not to turn out in as high numbers as the middle classes. On the other hand, the elderly favour Remain, and the elderly favour Leave, and the young favour Remain, and the elderly are more likely to turn out than the young. So that's why it's so difficult to call. The other big area of uncertainty post-vote is what kind of deal the UK would be taking part in. So the first and least economically damaging sort of deal would be to join the European Economic Area, which Britain used to be in a long time ago, which Norway is a part of. But being in the EEA requires free labour movement, accepting that, and it requires a contribution into the EU budget. So those two things are among the two things that the Leave campaign has been least keen on. So it might be hard for them to accept a deal post-Brexit that was like the Norway deal. Switzerland, not in the EEA, but have a similar kind of deal where they have to accept free movement. There are many more foreign-born people in Switzerland than there are in Britain as a proportion of the population. But it's not quite as good a deal in terms of services as is Norway's. And for Britain, services are more important than goods. We have a big trade deficit on goods, but in services we tend to pay our own way. So accepting a deal where our services exports were restricted wouldn't look good. So then we could go completely outside the EEA or any of these arrangements to avoid the freedom of movement. We could do a Canada-style deal, which has just been negotiated. It took 7 years for the Canadians to negotiate it, which is a long period of uncertainty in which we don't know what's going on. So again, this is going to be the big issue on Friday if it turns out, at least one of the big issues if it turns out there's a Leave vote. There is a debate about whether the EU will do a sweetheart deal. The argument is they need to export to us. We are they are 45% of our exports. We're about 9 or 10% of their exports. So you'd think the balance of power was more in favour for them than it would be for us. But I think the key argument for the EU governments would be Voltaire's thing about the British shooting an admiral pour encourage les autres. They won't want Britain to get a wonderfully nice deal because other countries might be thinking, oh, we'll go out the EU too and get a similar deals to Britain. So it'll be a tough negotiation process. Sovereignty, again, for, I think, some people, there was a column in the Times today arguing entirely on this principle. It's all about sovereignty. They don't care if economically it's damaging if Britain gets the right to make its own laws. But on the sovereignty issue, the question is, would the UK stay the UK if it voted to leave? It's pretty clear from the polls that Scotland will vote to remain. If you recall the 2014 referendum, that was quite close towards the end, and Scotland narrowly voted to stay part of the UK. The Scottish National Party has a majority in the Scottish Parliament, or near majority in the Scottish Parliament, would campaign quite vigorously, I suspect, for another independence poll. And if they'd been kept shut out of the EU by the traitorous English, I think they might well be tempted to vote for independence that way. Then there's the Irish border. Britain has a land border with the Republic of Ireland in Northern Ireland. Currently there are no border restrictions at all. You just drive across the road because it's like it's an EU border like Spain and Portugal. It's not possible to say that we will have control of our borders post an exit vote, as some Leave campaigners argue, and for that border to remain free. It's got to be one or the other. So either you've got to impose those controls, or you've got to let the Irish be in charge of Britain's border controls. And the question there is that at the time that we had those border controls, there was a lot of disruption to trade and a lot of ill feeling about it. And the position of Northern Ireland would also become more difficult. And finally, I think the fundamental issue about sovereignty is that it can be a little illusory. No country really is sovereign in a globalized world. The kind of issues that you debate, the kind of issues that politicians face, climate change, terrorism, mass migration, tax evasion, these are all issues on which people must cooperate in order to get anything done. And cooperation between international governments is a bit like sausage making. You don't really want to see it being done, but it has to be done. It gets done at 2:30 in the morning when Angela Merkel finally gives way to François Hollande on some key deal, or the other way round, and it's messy. And nobody then ever feels like they got exactly what they want. But you can't get what you want when you're collaborating with lots of other countries, and it just doesn't work that way. And the difficulty, I think, for politicians, and why we're having this debate, and why Donald Trump is doing so well, or at least got the Republican nomination in the States, is that it's easy for politicians to pretend, oh, if only we negotiate more toughly, or if I bash my fist, you know, that we will get the deal we want, but real life isn't like that. And the difficulty that mainstream politicians face is they make promises about what they can deliver for their country, and it's not within their power to deliver what they promise, and the voters get disillusioned. One reason why we're having this vote in the first place. So, the economic impact. It's generally agreed to be bad in the short term, and it just depends on the extent. So you can look at the forecasts from the IMF, the OECD, the Bank of England, the National Institute of Economic Social Research. We're talking a few percentage points over the, when we get out 14, 15 years from now, the margins are harder to call because it's not clear what sort of model that Britain would end up with. Maybe Britain will end up as the Hong Kong or Singapore of Europe. It's not entirely clear that that would be a tremendously politically popular route to follow, but maybe it will happen. On the second point, the loss of tax revenue from a small economy would more than offset the 8 billion or so that the UK pays into the EU budget. So there's no great windfall that's going to emerge to buy off the voters. And then the key, what drives those forecasts, one is the threat of reduced investment coming from the confidence factor, the FDI factor, reduced trade, and also if we did have immigration controls, the ability to run the labour market as efficiently as it does now would clearly be affected. So there will be skill shortages for companies as we try to sort out a new system. So again, all those factors are likely to lead to a slightly weaker economy. And then there's the political impact. And I think that probably in all the debate is the most underestimated. If the vote is to leave on Friday, this will be a rejection of the political elite of the UK. The heads of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, okay, slightly reluctantly, but the Labour Party is in favour of Remain, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Nationalist Party, the Welsh Nationalist Party, the Green Party, all of these people are in favour of Remain. It's only the United Kingdom Independence Party that is against it, a classic sort of insurgent party. So it's virtually inconceivable that David Cameron could stay in office after such a vote, and George Osborne, his key lieutenant, would probably have to go as well. So then there would be the question of who would take office. I think it's got to be likely that those who campaigned for leave would be voted into office by the Conservative Party. It's hard to imagine a pro-Remain politician being voted in by a Conservative Party which had rebelled against its leader so strongly. So you would have Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, or someone trying to push through a deal with the EU, and probably going for the maximal Brexit, so not join the EEA, but going for complete withdrawal, no payments into the budget, and no free movement of labour. The difficulty there is that position within the UK Parliament currently commands about 200 or so MPs, that the majority of MPs would be on the other side. So you'd be trying to push this deal through a very reluctant opposition, but the opposition, of course, would be stymied by the fact that if they voted it down, they would risk the wrath of the voters who might feel that they were trying to block the views of the electorate. So what we might see is a further election to put the terms of any Brexit deal to the electorate. In that election, let's recall that a year ago, the Conservative Party won a very narrow majority, and in the last year or so, they've basically split down the middle on this particular issue. So it's quite hard to see the Conservative vote going significantly up in that election and might go down. So you might easily see a change of government with the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, supported by the Scottish Nationalist Party, coming into office within the next 12 months or so, which again would be another layer of political risk. And then there's the political risk for the European Union. This, again, just as it's a rejection of the British political elite, I think it would be seen as a rejection of the European elite. The European Union has always been seen a bit like a shark. It has to keep moving forward or it's going to die. And for a country to withdraw from the EU, even one as difficult and contrary as Britain, would be seen as a blow to the prestige of the whole prospect. It would strengthen the hands of Eurosceptic forces like Le Pen in France, there's an election coming up next year, Grillo in Italy, and so on. We may see more referenda in other countries about whether other countries would leave the EU. And it's probably going to be bad, therefore, for the Eurozone economy and for the euro as well as it is for the British economy because of that uncertainty which pervades everything. So, in short, and to finish up, because I know there's a panel coming on in a minute, it is an extremely momentous decision. I certainly don't know which way the electorate's going to vote. I would be cautious, if I were you, on believing the gambling markets which are so confident that Remain will win. I suspect it will be a small margin either way, and it has divided the nation quite significantly over the last 4 months. So I hope on Friday that we can look beyond it and get on with our lives and talk about the weather and the sport as British people traditionally do. But I think it's going to have more profound effects than that. Thank you very much.